For centuries, debt was feared as weakness, a temporary burden to be escaped quickly. Kings avoided it, merchants limited it, and societies treated borrowing as moral failure. But Britain saw something others missed. Debt could be transformed into permanent fuel. Not a curse, but an engine powerful enough to move empires forward indefinitely. Britain's wars were expensive, relentless, and impossible to finance using taxes alone. Gold reserves vanished quickly, while military ambition expanded faster than revenues allowed. Instead of shrinking ambition, Britain rewrote the relationship between money and time. It decided tomorrow's wealth could be spent today, if belief could bridge the gap. The national debt emerged not as emergency, but as design. Britain issued bonds promising future repayment, turning citizens into silent empire investors. People lent to the state not from loyalty, but because interest made debt respectable. Borrowing stopped signaling desperation and began signaling opportunity. The creation of government bonds changed psychology across British society profoundly. Debt became safe, organized, tradable, and detached from shame entirely. You could own debt, sell debt, inherit debt, and profit from debt peacefully. Britain turned obligation into asset, rewriting the moral language of money. Banks grew confident lending because government debt created a stable benchmark. If the state could borrow endlessly, so could institutions operating beneath it. Credit expanded downward, from crown to corporations, to ordinary households slowly. Debt stopped being exceptional and became structural. Merchants learned borrowing allowed expansion without waiting for accumulated savings. Factories could be built, ships launched, and railways planned using future income. Britain's industrial rise accelerated because credit collapsed time into opportunity. Growth became front-loaded, paid for later through discipline and belief. Interest was the critical innovation that made debt emotionally acceptable. It framed borrowing as rational exchange, rather than moral weakness or failure. Britain perfected interest mathematics, embedding it into contracts, courts, and expectations. Once interest felt normal, debt felt inevitable. London emerged as the world's capital of credit, not merely trade. Its markets priced risk, time, and uncertainty with growing precision. Foreign governments borrowed in London because British credit appeared disciplined. Debt carried British credibility wherever it travelled. Colonies were introduced to credit systems, replacing traditional barter and obligation networks. Taxes, wages, and trade slowly required participation in debt-based monetary systems. Local economies became dependent on borrowing cycles managed from London. Britain exported credit alongside governance, reshaping societies fundamentally. Crises tested this system repeatedly, yet Britain refined rather than abandoned it. When debt grew uncomfortable, refinancing replaced repayment as the preferred solution. Old debt became new debt under improved terms and extended timelines. Britain learned debt rarely needed settling, only rolling forward continuously. This rolling system required confidence above all else. As long as lenders believed repayment would happen eventually, the illusion held. Britain protected this belief fiercely through law, reputation, and financial stability. Confidence became more valuable than solvency. Households slowly entered the credit system through mortgages and consumer borrowing. Owning homes, businesses, or futures now required participation in long-term debt. Debt tied citizens emotionally to stability, discouraging rebellion and radical change. Britain discovered credit created obedience more effectively than force. Banks became architects of everyday life, not merely money handlers. They decided who could marry, build, travel, or invest through lending access. Credit scores replaced character, and paperwork replaced personal trust. Britain normalized surveillance through finance long before digital tracking existed. International trade expanded rapidly because credit smoothed payment delays. Ships sailed without immediate cash exchange, relying on promises across oceans. bills of exchange linked continents through trust chains anchored in London. Debt became the invisible glue holding global trade together. Governments realized borrowing allowed political promises without immediate sacrifice. Public services expanded faster than taxation could support comfortably. Debt delayed political consequences, shifting costs onto future generations quietly. Britain demonstrated how democracies could grow without confronting limits immediately. Critics warned debt would eventually demand repayment with painful consequences. But Britain argued growth would always outpace obligations eventually. This optimism sustained credit expansion across decades of relative stability. The illusion deepened as prosperity reinforced belief. By the 20th century, living without debt felt impossible. Governments, corporations, and individuals planned lives around borrowed futures. Debt defined progress, ambition, and normalcy across societies. Britain had taught the world to live forward financially. The illusion worked because collapse was always postponed. Crises were managed, delayed, softened, or restructured through financial innovation. Debt became too big to fail, too embedded to remove. Britain understood systems survive when dismantling them feels more dangerous than maintaining them. World wars pushed debt to unprecedented levels, yet the system survived. Entire nations borrowed survival into existence, trusting future growth to compensate. Britain proved debt could outlast catastrophe if belief endured. The illusion became doctrine, not experiment. After wars, rebuilding relied heavily on credit once again. Debt financed reconstruction, welfare states, and modern infrastructure across continents. Britain's model became global standard, adopted without serious alternative discussion. The world accepted debt as the cost of modernity. Financial markets evolved to trade debt itself as commodity. Bonds, derivatives, and interest instruments multiplied complexity and scale. Debt detached further from reality, becoming abstraction traded globally. Britain helped design this abstraction, embedding it into global finance permanently. Today, debt defines governments, corporations, and individual identity alike. Living without borrowing feels regressive, even irresponsible. In modern economies, the illusion persists because abandoning it threatens everything simultaneously. Britain taught the world this dependency step by step. Yet beneath stability is a silent question rarely asked openly. What happens when belief finally meets mathematical limits? Britain postponed the answer for centuries through clever design. But illusions eventually demand confrontation. As debt expanded globally, Britain realized something extraordinary had occurred quietly beneath daily economic routines. Borrowing was no longer a tool for emergencies. It had become the default condition of modern life. Entire systems assumed continuous credit growth, treating repayment as secondary, almost symbolic. Britain had normalized a future permanently mortgaged to the present. Governments stopped asking whether debt should exist and began debating only how much debt was acceptable. Budgets were written assuming deficits, and surpluses became politically suspicious or unnecessary. Borrowing enabled promises without sacrifice, postponing consequences beyond electoral memory. Britain perfected this delay, turning time itself into a political resource. Central banks emerged as guardians of the illusion, tasked with maintaining confidence above all else. Interest rates became psychological levers, nudging behavior without overt coercion. Lower rates encouraged borrowing, higher rates disciplined excess, yet never questioned debt's legitimacy. Money policy shifted from moral restraint to emotional management of expectations. Households internalized this logic completely, structuring entire lives around long-term repayment schedules. Education, housing, healthcare, and retirement all required credit participation. Debt ceased feeling dangerous and instead felt necessary for dignity and opportunity. Britain had rewired aspiration itself through finance. Corporations embraced leverage as strategy, borrowing not because they lacked cash, but because debt boosted returns. Balance sheets prioritized optimization more than safety, assuming constant access to refinancing. Failure became manageable through restructuring rather than liquidation. Britain taught capitalism to float on promises rather than foundations. Global markets rewarded debt-driven growth more than cautious restraint. Nations expanding rapidly through borrowing attracted admiration, not suspicion. Credit ratings measured confidence, not sustainability, reinforcing the illusion structurally. Britain's intellectual framework shaped how success itself was defined internationally. Crises revealed cracks, yet responses deepened dependency rather than correcting course. When systems trembled, governments injected more credit to stabilize confidence. Debt solved debt, postponing collapse while increasing future fragility silently. Britain's model survived by expanding whenever it faced existential threat. The language around debt softened deliberately, reframing obligation as investment or stimulus. Borrowing funded growth narratives, not warnings about limits. Public discourse avoided discussing absolute repayment, focusing instead on managing ratios. Words protected belief more effectively than numbers ever could. Developing nations entered the system later, but faster, borrowing to accelerate modernization immediately. Infrastructure, welfare, and industrialization arrived financed by external debt. Repayment schedules extended across generations, embedding dependency into national futures. Britain's model globalized inequality through mathematics rather than conquest. Financial instruments grew more complex, masking risk behind layers of abstraction. Derivatives, securitization, and leverage obscured who owed what to whom. This opacity reduced fear, allowing debt to expand unnoticed. Britain helped engineer complexity as camouflage for unsustainable accumulation. Cultural attitudes shifted as debt lost stigma entirely. Borrowing signaled ambition, while avoidance implied stagnation or backward thinking. Even governments boasting fiscal discipline relied on hidden liabilities. Britain made debt invisible by making it universal. Technology accelerated the illusion further, digitizing money and accelerating credit cycles. Instant lending removed friction, encouraging impulse borrowing and consumption. Debt became seamless, painless, and detached from physical awareness. Britain's original abstraction reached its logical extreme in digital finance. Central banks reassured populations continuously through language, press conferences, and forecasts. Their confidence mattered more than their balance sheets. As long as authority spoke calmly, belief remained intact. Britain's insight proved timeless. Reassurance sustained systems longer than truth. Yet mathematical reality never disappears. It waits patiently beneath belief. Interest compounds regardless of confidence, and obligations grow silently. Eventually, growth slows, demographics shift, and assumptions weaken. The illusion begins to strain, not collapse, but reveal tension. When limits approach, societies face painful choices, disguised as technical adjustments. Austerity, inflation, currency debasement, or restructuring replace honest confrontation. Each option preserves the system while redistributing pain unevenly. Britain perfected this redistribution, protecting belief at any cost. The greatest danger lies not in collapse, but in dependency becoming irreversible. Systems too large to fail cannot be dismantled without destroying livelihoods. Debt binds citizens to stability through fear of disruption. Britain discovered this fear was stronger than loyalty or ideology. Modern politics revolves around managing debt narratives rather than solving debt itself. Elections promise growth without addressing structural reliance on borrowing. Debate avoids fundamentals, circling symptoms endlessly. The illusion persists because confronting it threatens everything simultaneously. Globally, debt now exceeds productive capacity, yet markets continue functioning calmly. Confidence substitutes for collateral, and expectation replaces discipline. Britain's experiment reached planetary scale, sustained by shared denial. No nation can exit alone without severe consequences. The world now lives inside a system where debt defines possibility. Growth requires borrowing. Stability requires refinancing. Peace requires postponement. The illusion sustains civilization while quietly narrowing future options. Britain's design succeeded too well to abandon safely. The question is no longer whether debt is dangerous. The question is whether modern society can imagine life without it. Britain taught the world to forget that alternative, and forgotten ideas are the hardest to recover. The credit illusion remains intact because belief still outweighs mathematics. But belief has limits, even when enforced by institutions and habit. History shows systems collapse not when wrong, but when unquestioned too long. Britain built the most convincing illusion money has ever known. If this story changed how you see debt and modern life, remember, the strongest systems survive by hiding their weaknesses. Subscribe for more untold histories of money and power. Because the next crisis always begins with belief.